Hey everyone, my name is Todd Bigelow. For the past 30 years, I've been a freelance photographer based primarily out of Los Angeles, an adjunct professor of photography and photojournalism, and a soon-to-be author on a book on freelance business practices. This is 2 Minutes with Todd, where I break down business topics that freelancers face on a near daily basis. Let's get into it. So today, let's go into a little bit about model releases, when they're required and when they're not. The thing you want to keep in mind about model releases is not necessarily who you're shooting or what you're shooting. A model release is going to be required or determined to not be required based upon how the image is going to be used. So that's what you want to have in your head constantly when you're thinking, oh, can I license this photograph? Do I need a model release? The thing that you just have to keep in mind is, how's the image going to be used? So we're going to break it down into two categories because that's the most common two ways, right? One is editorial. In an editorial usage of an image that you shot either on assignment or out on your own, assuming you're shooting in public, you do not need to have a model release for editorial use of the photograph. So you go out on a protest, okay, and you're out in the streets and you're shooting people exercising their First Amendment rights. Or let's just say you're out street shooting, or you're out on a hike and you're photographing, beautiful, people enjoying nature, mountain biking, anything along those lines. You're in public, they're in public, you have a right to photograph. You have a right to use those images and license them for editorial use. So what is editorial use? Generally speaking, editorial use means that there is a connection between the photograph that's being used and any sort of story or narrative. Now, that does not mean there has to be written word. The photograph itself could stand alone to tell the story. It's a story of, that day's protests, or, it could be a single image, what we would call in the newspaper world, when we're out there shooting feature art to fill a hole, in what used to be the print newspaper. And it's just a fun picture of something going on in the community. That's editorial use, okay? So there's a narrative, a connection usually between the photograph and a narrative, a written story, again, a standalone image. What is not happening with editorial use, and this is key, what is not happening is there's no attempt to sell you any sort of product, service, or idea, okay? So that is the key principle you need to keep in mind. So as long as it's an editorial use, you do not need a release. So what are some examples? Magazines, websites that are devoted to news and culture and art and so forth, right? So those are our modern day publications. Newspapers, textbooks are editorial use. Okay. So sometimes people get hung up on the fact, well, people have to buy those, right? So they pay for subscriptions, they buy a textbook. So doesn't that make it a commercial use? They're paying money for it. No, absolutely not. Okay. So again, there's a connection between the photograph being used and to tell a story or to provide some information. There's nothing that is being endorsed, or there's no product attempt to sell you an idea or a service or anything along that lines. That's key for editorial use. That also includes street photography and perhaps getting those exhibited in a gallery. Okay, let's go into the second category, commercial use. Okay, commercial use is obviously somebody is trying to sell you on a product or a service. Okay, that's the most obvious. So think of advertisements. That would be a commercial use. So if somebody comes to you and wants to use your image, which just happened to me 2 months ago, not even 2 months ago, a month and a half ago, a large social media platform that deals with neighbors, came to me and asked if I could license them a photograph for use on their website. It would be a commercial use because they would use it to promote their services, which are commercial services. And I did have a release for that image. So that would be a perfect example of when I would need to have a release because the person is identifiable in that image. And we'll get to that in a second. Okay? But there's no narrative in commercial use. There's no narrative of a story being told or information being shared. The key component of the use of a photograph in commercial application, commercial use of a photograph, is to sell you on a service, product, or idea. So here's an example I like to give. Let's say I go out and I photograph the Lakers and I'm shooting LeBron. This is hypothetical, but let's say that's the case, right? I'm down on the floor and I'm shooting, and let's say I'm shooting for Sports Illustrated. It's sports. I don't have to get LeBron's model release to use that image in a story for Sports Illustrated. It could be a story about how great he is, or he's, nearing the end of his career. It could be any sort of story. It could be a story on the philanthropy that he's involved in. And my job is to photograph him on the court and then maybe spend some time off the court with him. No model release is necessary. Okay? Let's say I get a really telling photograph of him, just sweat dripping off of him on the sidelines. And, part of the story is that he is just, playing so many minutes and it's just really taking a toll on his body. And I get this shot where he's, swigging a bottle of Gatorade, which sponsors the team, and so forth and so on. And Sports Illustrated uses that photograph, hypothetically again, in a story. And he's swigging the Gatorade. No model release is necessary from anyone because there's a narrative that's being told. Okay, that's an editorial use. Now, let's say 2 months later, some company comes to me, whoever it might be, and says, we want to use that photograph we saw in Sports Illustrated. Let's say it's Gatorade. And they say he's, swigging this bottle of Gatorade and sweat's dripping off of him. And boy, it's such a dynamic picture. We want to use it. Well, what do they want to use it for? They want to use it to promote their product, Gatorade, right? There's no narrative. They might, design it up with all sorts of words and so forth, but there's no narrative. The photograph would be used. Again, how is the image being used? It would be used to sell the service, product, or idea, and in this case, a product. In that case, I would definitely need to have the athlete LeBron's model release. I cannot use his likeness to sell an idea without his permission. Okay, so there's an example of the same image being used in an editorial way and the same image being used in a commercial way. If it's commercial, you need a model release. Okay, last caveat. We're talking about images where the subject is identifiable. Okay, so if you have silhouettes of people or their backs are turned and you cannot clearly identify who they are, okay, and that is going to be 99.9% of the time, then you do not need a release to authorize a commercial use of the image, okay? But it has to be clear that the person is not identifiable, okay? If you're going to, get to that gray line and you're not quite sure, my recommendation, of course, is to err on the side of caution and get a release, okay? People that I photograph that I get releases from primarily are family and friends when I'm out and about, because I shoot a lot of stuff when I'm just enjoying life in general, because it'll help build my archive. Many people in my family are model released on my site, including my son and my wife, and I've licensed a lot of those images over time, both editorially and commercially. Okay, so again, to leave you with the key point, an image needs to have a model release based on how the image is used. Okay, a question of a model release is based upon how the image will be used. Editorially, a model release is not required. Okay, commercially, for identifiable people, a model release is required. And again, commercially, you got to think of as endorsing a product, service, or idea. Advertising is the most obvious example. Okay, so keep that in mind when you're shooting and when you're gonna obviously go on and use those images in different ways when people approach you. Make sure you know when a model release is required so that you don't get yourself into any legal trouble. Okay, pay attention to your contracts out there. Pay attention to who owns the rights to your images. Pay attention to the model releases, and best of luck going forward.